trek over from Northbrook. I understand it wasn't, as close as it is, it wasn't all that easy.
Well, it's typical Chicago traffic, so about an hour. There's always something happening on the expressways here.
There's always something. So for people who aren't familiar or who've seen the UL logo, which is ubiquitous, but don't know exactly what that stands for and who's behind it, give us the quick thumbnail about Underwriters Laboratories.
I'd be happy to. UL, as a Chicago company, started as an outgrowth of the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And the company actually started in 1894. But Chicago World's Fair was probably the first large-scale exhibition of electricity. And in fact, it was a big electrical building. And they had a lot of problems with fires and electrical shock. And so the insurance underwriters who provided the fire and casualty insurance for the fair brought a guy in from MIT who was able to solve a lot of the problems. And then the underwriters recognized that, in fact, there was a real benefit to them as businesses and to society by having systems that would limit or reduce or eliminate property and casualty loss related to electric shock and fire. And so actually they started, the National Board of Fire Underwriters started two companies. They started the National Fire Protection Association, which still exists. It's in Quincy, Massachusetts. And their role is to create the National Electrical Code, and they still do that. And then they started Underwriters Laboratories, and our role was to write standards and develop test methods to ensure that electrical products were safe to be connected to the electrical grid. And so that's our beginning, and we've grown from there into a global company.
And the UL logo appears, what, literally billions of times a year?
There are about 22 billion UL marks issued every year, and if you go through your house and do a search, you'll probably find about 125 UL marks in your house.
Right. So that basically to lay people, and of course even to professionals, it says this is safe, at least according to, if it's used correctly and all the ways you're supposed to use it. And so you are, as I said before, synonymous with safety. So about 3 years ago, UL made a conscious decision to go into the environmental space. You created a new entity called UL Environment. Why environment? There's so many different arenas where there's standards needed, where there needs to be some sense made that are emerging of new technologies in new areas. Why did you pick the environment?
Well, if you look at UL mission, the first line of the UL mission, bless you, is to promote safe living and working environments for people. And we think that's what we did with electricity, going back to the beginning of the 19th century. And in fact, we think that the existence of a national electrical code and the existence of third-party testing and certification for wiring devices and wire and electrical appliances really helped to speed the adoption of electricity in the US because it reduced public concern about the risk. But when we think about safe living and working environments, clearly the impact of products on the environment is a critical area. And we saw more and more from our clients concerns about hazardous materials that were in their products. We got involved in discussions, sometimes very contentious discussions between people like the Consumer Electronics Association and the National Association of Fire Marshals, where the fire marshals want all the plastic on your plasma TV to be brominated so it won't burn. And the Consumer Electronics Association doesn't want to do that because of environmental concerns.
In e-waste, when it goes back into the landfill, is that?
All of those issues. And so we started to get more and more questions from our clients about hazardous materials, about outgassing of things like bromine, about energy efficiency, a wide range of things. And we came to believe that environmental safety was as important as electrical and fire safety to this mission of promoting safe living and working environments for people.
So this is as much about individual safety as it is, and in fact even more so in some ways than it is about planetary safety. That's an outcome if you successfusly move the markets in a certain direction.
I think you would say that is exactly right.
Mm-hmm. So give us a sense of where you're headed, because there's so many different products and categories, as I said before, that simply have no standards. Where have you started out? where are you going with this?
Well, you know, this is it's a huge industry, and the head of our environmental business, Steve Wentz, I think has the hardest job in UL, because he has to try to create a new business in a new market. And so it is actually hard to prioritize things. One of the early areas we looked at, of course, was energy efficiency. And energy efficiency clearly relates to planetary value, but it also relates directly to all the people that we deal with who make electrical goods, and that's a large part of our manufacturer client base. And then we also started to look at areas like indoor air quality. And we said, okay, indoor air quality really relates to this whole area of green buildings. And green buildings obviously are about a lot of things. They're about energy efficiency, they're about the environment inside the building, and how it affects the people inside the building, which is more personal than planetary. And we said, all right, well, if indoor air quality is an issue, then there should be standards for things like drywall and fire doors and all kinds of building materials, obviously carpet and other kinds of things. Some of those were being addressed by other people, so we said, why don't we try to address ones where we have a competence where there's nobody addressing the issue. And so we started looking at those kinds of products and developing standards. As you know, the consensus-based standard process takes time, yet we've had success with things like drywall. And then we said, okay, then we should also get into indoor air quality testing, which is why we recently acquired AQS.
Right.
So those are a couple of areas we looked at. And then we also had a lot of interest from people about, well, you know, can you have a green product if you don't have a green process in your company? So that got us into this consideration that led to the development of something you may know as UL 880, which is a corporate sustainability standard. And we said this could be something really valuable, because there's a lot of companies who want legitimately to be recognized as being sustainable, but how do they do that? Right. And there is an ISO standard, but the ISO standard specifically says that you cannot certify to that standard.
Right. So there are a lot of things dealing with companies and GRI, and Mike Wallace who is here talking about that in one of the workshops later. Also, just to disclose, GreenBiz Group, my company, has been partnered with UL in the development of the 880 standard, the company level standard for manufacturers. It strikes me, and it's been my experience in the 2 years or so that we've been working, our two organizations have been working closely together in this, that this is a little bit out of the box for UL in a couple ways. One is that it's about companies and not products, and I think that's maybe the first time you've done that, looked at companies, not products. But the other is, and this goes to something you were referring to before about feedback from stakeholders and input, that I don't know that you knew what you were getting into in terms of the breadth of the interested parties in this. Talk a little bit about why you think there's an opportunity here for a company level standard and why you'd want to take that on.
Well, we do manage about 1,500 standards in the US that are product standards. And every one of those standards, or actually most of those standards, has a standards technical panel which involves industry, government, academia, consumers. And so we're used to a lot of input. We're not used to as much input as we got with UL 880, and we're not accustomed to the kind of diversity of input we got. But that was actually terrific, because it makes UL 880 a lot better. What really we believed is we believed that we could contribute something unique in this space, in that, first of all, UL is an independent testing laboratory. And so one of the things that we do is we don't take money from any manufacturer except for doing the engineering work that we do. And we don't allow any client or potential client to sit on our board. And we are a not-for-profit company, a 501c3. So we think our independence is a value. We think our experience at doing standards development in a consensus-based process is an asset. And then we looked at something, and this is what probably the most unique thing for us, is to develop a standard where we don't intend to actually be the testing agency for the standard. So in fact, what we expect with UL 880 is that audit firms like maybe a big accounting firm or an ISO audit firm, someone like that, and many companies like that will actually do the auditing work, and the UL will simply manage the standard and issue the final certification. For us, that's very different, but we think there's a real value added to make it a very publicly accessible standard and have lots of competition for who can do the auditing work.
I think what we've all looked at 880 and its subsequent standards as the Full Employment for Consultants Act of 2011, I think.
I think that was probably Sarbanes-Oxley, but
oh, okay, well.
and before that it was Y2K.
Well, it's this year's flavor of the month, I guess. So you talked about you acquired AQS, the organization that has the Green Guard standard. Last summer, I believe you acquired TerraChoice, the organization that runs the environmental choice or green label in Canada.
Eco-logo.
Eco-logo, thank you. Yeah. As well as setting a number of other standards. What's the vision here? I mean, is this, being acquisitive, you have these grand visions. What do you see UL being in the environmental space in the next, they say, 5 years?
Well, so it goes back to the mission to promote safe living and working environments for people. The first thing and a major driver for UL environmental business is simply to be able to serve the existing 65,000 clients we have who need these kinds of services. So if you're a company making cell phones, you need a lot of these services today because your clients who are going to be buying these cell phones are more and more interested in having a green certification on the product, but they want a green certification with credibility. And so if you're making a cell phone, you can come to UL for safety certification of the phone and the battery. You can come to UL for testing and maybe certification related to the wireless protocol of the phone itself, but you also want a green certification. So the first motivation is actually to serve our existing clients, and we've gotten many, many, many requests from existing clients, big manufacturers who want these services. But then the second area of interest for us was to see where could we contribute more broadly in the environmental space to help promote this idea of safe living and working environments for people. And going back to the subject of bromine and plastic, that's one of the ones that we're going to get in the middle of anyway. We may as well have a position and try to be promoting a good outcome.
Is there a limit to how many standards and certifications? I'm wondering if you learned in safety, you know, at some point, does everything have to be certified, or is there some natural point? What do you see as the potential here? Because I think there's, as much as there is interest on the part of, as you're saying, some of your 65,000 clients, and saying, we need to have the rules, we need to understand where to aim, to what it means to be good or better or best. But is there some point where we've just created way too many, a bigger monster than we'd like to or need?
I think, you know, our marketplace and our industry does both certification and testing without certification. And what I would say is that probably more of the work that's done in our industry is testing that ends in a test report, as opposed to testing that ends in a certification.
Explain that. What's a test report?
Well, so you're a big box retailer and you're going to be buying circular saws from somebody who's an OEM, and you're going to put it under your house label. But you've got a list of specifications related to the performance of that product. You would hire an outside laboratory like UL to test it and verify, yes, it is 3,000 RPM and so on and so forth. That's a lot of what happens in our industry, and it's simply a test report that provides confidence to a manufacturer or to a retailer. Another good example, you're making printers, and you're warranting to your client, to the consumer, that this printer can print 250,000 copies in its useful life. Well, somebody's got to test that.
So those are both performance characteristics of a saw or a printer. How does that translate into, how would you work with a company on an environmental claim or environmental performance?
Well, so there's two aspects of that, and one is you can do what's called environmental claims verification, where a manufacturer wants to make a specific set of claims. They want a third party to test the product to, in fact, validate that the product meets those claims. That may not result in a certification mark. But where certification marks are important is where you have a need to create a level playing field and an understanding among consumers when they see a label that in fact this is a credible label and it was done on a level playing field. I think a good example that I might use would be the organic food label. And you can remember, as I can, that years ago there were a proliferation of products in the supermarket claiming to be organic. And then the FDA, seeing this mess, created standards for what you have to meet in order to put an organic label on your product. A lot of things lost the organic label, but now when you go into a supermarket and buy something with the USDA organic label on it, you have a sense of confidence that it meets a specific standard and it's on a level playing field.
I want to go back to my earlier question because I'm not sure I got the kind of answer I was seeking in terms of the number of standards that can be created around green attributes and specifications. Is it in the dozens, is it in the hundreds, is it in the thousands? How many standards can the market, or does it need, or can it accommodate?
Well, I think it could be in the thousands.
Wow.
And I think it really depends on the product. But you know, there are thousands of standards now for electrical safety, but you don't apply thousands of standards to one product. So we would have a safety standard for smoke detectors, right, and we would have a safety standard for fire extinguishers, and those standards wouldn't apply to each other. And in the environmental space, it may look a little bit differently. For example, you may have a standard for volatile organic compound emission, which could apply to a wide range of indoor building materials and products. But you may also, and probably will have, standards that apply to specific things like drywall, fire doors, carpet.
Mm-hmm. UL's a global organization. You're in 80, 90, 100, I don't know, some number of countries?
Yes, something like that.
Something like
yeah.
that. A lot of countries.
A lot.
Is the market in both the, I'd love to hear about what the opportunity is in both the developed and developing world. And are the standards, do you envision the standards for a product, let alone a company, changing from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or do you see the opportunity or the need for global standards?
Yeah, one of the problems we have in the standards world in general is that there are standards, national standards, all over the place. And one of the things that we have been saying for 5 years on the safety side is that it would be a real benefit to the world to harmonize standards and to create global standards. So you'd have one global standard, one test, one certification if certification was required, and you would be done with it. And that's a really easy thing to say, and everyone can agree with the general principle, but it's hard to find anyone who can then agree with a specific application to make that happen. I think environmental maybe offers an opportunity because a lot of the standards are new, don't exist yet, and so it may be an opportunity for the world to move closer on creating harmonized standards from the beginning. One of the things that we're involved with is the 2011 APEC meeting, which will be in Honolulu.
That's the Asia-Pacific.
Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation area. And the U.S., of course, is the host country this year. And the U.S. government is deciding the agenda. And one of the things that they're seriously considering, we've been encouraging them to consider, is to start to create a dialogue among APEC countries about harmonizing standards. And we've actually encouraged them to try to take newer technologies and newer areas like renewable energy, environmental standards, and try to work to harmonize those from the beginning rather than harmonize them after they all are in creation. And it seems to be quite a bit of interest from the government to do that. It may not happen through APEC, but there's a subset of APEC called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a smaller group of countries who have common free trade interests, like the United States, like Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, who may be able to make this move a little more quickly. And I think it would be a real service to manufacturers and consumers to have harmonized global standards.
And are companies asking for that? Do they want to be able to have the same standards for environmental performance or environmental attributes in Eastern Europe and South America and Southeast Asia, China, US?
Generally, yes.
And do you think it's realistic?
I think it's realistic. I think it's a life's work for somebody, unfortunately, because agreeing to the principle and then agreeing to the details are two different things.
Yeah.
But it's something we really should be doing, because this blizzard of standards we have that conflict with each other lead to unintended bad consequences. At the APEC meeting in Yokohama, one of the speakers from one of the Japanese appliance companies was talking about the one home laundry machine they make, simply a washing machine. And he pointed out that they sell this machine around the world, but they have to make 31 different versions of the same product in order to comply with local standards in the countries they sell in. Well, the manufacturer doesn't benefit from that. The consumer doesn't benefit from that. Safety doesn't actually benefit from that, because the standards all kind of get to the same point. And the competitors don't benefit from that. Just we all end up paying a little bit more money.
One of the things I find interesting about UL's environmental play here is that you created it in the last few years. And I'm wondering, as opposed to some of the other standards organizations, environmental standards organizations that did this maybe in the 90s, Green Seal, for example, back pre-internet, pre-social media, pre-crowdsourcing, given that this is a topic where pretty much everybody is an expert or thinks there is an expert or certainly has an opinion, informed or not, what are the challenges and opportunities you find of creating an environmental standard in the 21st century that you may not have expected or anticipated based on your 100 and some odd years of standard making?
Well, I think if UL 880 is any indication, we're going to have a lot more interest and involvement in creating standards. And we're going to have to figure out a way to manage that. Happily for us, years ago, UL developed an online interactive collaborative standards development system. And so, in fact, we're able to use that system online and let people work collaboratively without physically meeting. And that has helped us a lot, and I think it will help us in the future. And in fact, it's a system that has been used not only by UL, but we've also lent it to other people. So, for example, we lent it to a group of Caribbean nations a few years ago to develop collaboratively a standard for protecting coral reefs. So it can be used for all kinds of stuff. And I think that's going to be really important. And you're right back to the internet and social media and crowdsourcing. You know, we need to find the way to make that really a good advantage for us.
Well, is it helpful? Is more better in this case? Is it having, because you think of the standards and the safety arena, your stakeholders were largely some fire marshals and building code people, the manufacturers, and an assortment of associations and nonprofit safety geeks. Now you're talking about sustainability, which is everybody and everything, and so you've got a lot more people weighing in. Is more better? Do having hundreds or thousands of people, where you might have had dozens before, weighing in on a standard, make it a better standard?
Well, not necessarily, and that's the challenge of managing the process. I'd say for those of you who have read a standard, you'll understand, though, how arcane they are. About the only thing harder to read than a standard is federal legislation. And so people don't just read it frivolously and put comments in. It's not meant to be exclusionary in any way. It's just that's the way standards have to be. Yeah. So I'm not particularly worried about that problem. If it happens, we'll have to find a way to deal with it. But we don't want to just arbitrarily exclude voices that may add value to the conversation.
Yeah, and like federal legislation or any legislation, individual sentences, words, and even punctuation can make a big difference. And I think that's the challenge. I want to get to questions in just a second, but give us a little sense of crystal ball thinking here in terms of where you see the world of sustainability-related standards in 5 years. Is it going to be far more confusing? Is it going to be more chaos before there's order, or do you see it starting to come together in some way?
I think it will actually start to come together, and I think right now, because it's a very early stage of development, most people don't know what to do, including us, and we're all kind of finding our way in terms of what's valuable and what isn't valuable. But I think what's going to start to develop will be some rational strategies that companies will be able to take in terms of how they're going to deal with sustainability based on the customers they have in the industry they're in. And I described it the other day to one of my colleagues as at one end of the spectrum, it's your basic conformer, someone who says, I'm only going to do what I have to do and no more. And for some companies, that's probably a very rational business strategy. Yeah. And the other end of the spectrum is going to be people who want to be paragons of virtue and who see real value to them in having that image and operating their company that way. And there will be segments along the way between those two bookends, and it will start to make sense for people that, you know, this is what I should be doing based on what makes good sense for my business and maybe on how I want to differentiate myself versus my competitors in my industry space.
So I'm hearing more order than chaos.
I think more order will come along, and I think, you know, what's happened early on is the normal thing of any new industry, which is chaos and a high degree of entropy. But I think eventually people are going to start to be able to realize how they're going to marry corporate sustainability and social responsibility and the company's mission and business strategy. And they're going to pick their points along that spectrum and decide what they're going to do. Yeah. And I think it'll work.
Questions for Keith Williams? I can't see. Oh, there's like one over here.
Right under the light.
Yeah. If you could identify yourself too, that'd be great.
Gordon Rands, Western Illinois University.
Can you hear you?
Yeah,
okay.
We can hear you, so.
My question really comes off that last comment. You mentioned that there's a range of activity that people are going to want from the basic conformer to paragon of virtue. In safety, that doesn't seem to be there. I mean, you get the UL label on an extension cord, you know you can plug it in and it's going to be safe. But sustainability does have this range from we comply with the law to we are really trying to do everything we can to drive our environmental footprint down to zero, you know, as close as we can get on this product. So how doesn't that pose specific challenges? And I mean, you look at LEED, it's not just one LEED, it's multiple different standards. How do you see addressing that?
So safety is binary. It either is or it isn't. Right. Sustainability, not so much.
Well, that's exactly how we see it. And that safety, either the product meets a safety standard and it's okay for commerce, or it fails to meet a safety standard and it's not okay for commerce. And safety standards are never absolute in the sense that no product is absolutely perfectly safe because you couldn't make an affordable product or a usable product that was perfectly safe. How would you make a safe kitchen knife? And but safety standards are binary. Either it meets the standard or it doesn't. It's either safe for commerce or it isn't. And we don't think that safety should ever be the basis of competition. On the environmental side, there should be a basic level that you have to meet, which says that the product is basically safe for people and basically friendly to the environment. But then we think there's going to be, like LEED certification or other kinds of certification, a range of standards where people want to go far beyond the basic requirement. And that kind of good, better, best never evolved in safety. It was either yes or no. But in the environmental space, it seems to have evolved, and I think it plays nicely into companies' business strategies.
So you see individual standards having good, better, best levels, or silver, gold, platinum in the LEED vernacular, or do you see having a standard and then a better standard and a higher standard? How's that going to work?
I think it's quite likely that individual standards will have plateaus, so you could get a good, better, best kind of a rating under an environmental standard as opposed to a pass-fail.
Interesting. And
I think right now that may be actually appropriate for the market in terms of the way people want to compete and go to market.
And we see that with computers with the EPEAT standard or EPEAT certification, with the silver, gold. And in that standard, it turns out it was set too low that almost everything coming into the market is the highest of those three. I think it's gold or platinum, whatever it is. But they need to raise it now.
Yeah, maybe time for IEEE to revisit that.
Yep.
And that'll be true for environmental standards. I think, like all standards, by the way, they have to be continuously revised.
Has that been true with safety, where you've had to go because things got even safer or whatever?
Oh, absolutely. We continuously revise safety standards all the time. And they're not static documents. Because new technology comes along, you learn more about science, for example, maybe the science of smoke and how that could affect the performance of a smoke detector. So then it's necessary to go back and revise the standard. We do all the time.
Time for one more question right up over here. Get her a mic.
Thank you. Libby Burnick with 5 Winds. Could you talk a little bit about how you see the role of the federal government in setting these environmental standards, and how has EPA been involved or been part of this environmental standard setting process?
Yeah, thank you. I think everybody's been involved in one way or another. What's worked really well in the safety standard process has been the fact that safety standards for a century have been set by private companies like UL and ASTM, CSA in Canada, and other organizations. And because we're private organizations and because we work through this consensus standard process, we have the ability to move very quickly to change as change is required. And as I just mentioned, safety standards are evolving all the time. You know, certainly the EPA at the macro level has to set levels, maybe for carbon dioxide emission for the U.S., for example. But we think private standards that are done on a consensus basis and ideally accredited by ANSI offers industry a chance to move more quickly. And the one thing you never want is you never want a standard to inhibit innovation or to inhibit new technology or to prevent U.S. companies from moving ahead in the global competition.
In fact, if they work well, standards actually spur innovation because it gives everyone a base on which to operate, and then how do you use that as a platform? We've seen that in a number of arenas.
Well, that's right, and you know, we also see new products and new ideas come along all the time. You know, companies will send us a product that doesn't exactly meet an existing standard because it's very innovative. How do you deal with that? If it's a government standard, I think it could be a long time. But with private industry and consensus standards, you can deal with that quickly.
Well, we've run out of questions before we've run out of time. Craig Coulter, where are you? If you could, sitting in the back there, as with UL, he's going to be doing a workshop on the 880 standard. Is that today or tomorrow, Craig? Tomorrow. And hopefully, if you have a chance to stick around, I'm sure some other people will have more questions.
Thank you.
For now, please join me in thanking Keith Williams.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks.